The meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because the maple trees outside were just starting to turn, and I was thinking how beautiful they looked when Garrett Vance leaned across that cheap plastic table and said the words that would shatter everything I'd built. "Piper, I need you to adjust those numbers on the Brookfield site report." I looked up from my laptop where I'd been reviewing the soil samples for the third time, hoping somehow the lead levels would magically decrease. They hadn't. If anything, the retesting had confirmed what I already knew. That piece of land was a toxic nightmare waiting to happen. "Adjust them how?" I asked, though my gut already knew where this was heading. Garrett glanced around the temporary trailer we were using as a field office, making sure we were alone. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our 6 months working together on environmental assessments for his development company. "The city council meets Thursday to approve the elementary school construction. We need those contamination levels to fall within acceptable ranges." I stared at him. "Garrett, the soil contains lead concentrations 3 times higher than safety standards. There's cadmium, arsenic. This used to be an industrial battery plant." "You know this." "I know what the report currently says," he replied, his tone shifting to something harder. "But I also know we have investors who've already committed $47 million to this project. The city has already approved the architectural plans. Construction crews are scheduled to break ground next month." My chest felt tight. "You're asking me to falsify environmental data." "I'm asking you to find a way to make this work. You're the expert. Maybe the samples were contaminated during collection. Maybe the lab made errors. Maybe we need to test different areas of the property." I tested 12 different locations across the entire site. I used 3 separate labs. The results are consistent. I could hear my voice getting higher, but I couldn't stop myself. "This isn't a gray area, Garrett. This is black and white. Children will be playing on this ground. They'll be breathing this air every day." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those pale blue eyes that had seemed so trustworthy when I first took this contract. "Piper, you're 31 years old. You've been building your consulting practice for what, 4 years now? You've got a good reputation in this industry. Don't throw it away over numbers that can be interpreted different ways." Interpreted different ways? I felt something cold spreading through my chest. Lead poisoning doesn't care about interpretation. Garrett stood up and walked to the small window overlooking the Brookfield site. 200 acres of what would soon become Willowbrook Elementary School if I signed off on his lies. "Let me be very clear about something," he said without turning around. "I've been developing properties in this state for 15 years. I know every environmental consultant, every regulatory official, every engineering firm worth working with. If you can't be flexible on this project, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how difficult you are to work with." The threat hung between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "You're threatening to blacklist me." "I'm explaining reality." He turned back to face me. "This industry runs on relationships, trust, cooperation. Companies need consultants who understand that perfection is the enemy of progress. If you develop a reputation as someone who creates problems instead of solving them, who prioritizes theoretical risks over real-world economics, you'll find yourself with a lot of free time to contemplate your principles." I thought about my student loans, my mortgage, the 3 other projects I had lined up that could disappear with a few phone calls from Garrett to the right people. But then I thought about something else. My name is Piper Delacroix, and before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching. I need to know there are people out there who understand why I made the choice I'm about to tell you about. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story gets so much more complicated than what you think. See, what Garrett didn't know about me, what nobody in my professional life knew, was that for the past 3 years, I'd been anonymously funding a merit scholarship at Central State University. $5,000 every semester for a student studying environmental science. The recipient was someone I'd never met, someone whose essays about environmental justice and corporate responsibility had moved me to tears when I read them, as part of the scholarship committee's blind review process. That student was Madison Vance, Garrett's daughter. I discovered this completely by accident 8 months earlier when I attended a university fundraising dinner. Madison was there presenting her research on soil contamination in low-income neighborhoods, and when she mentioned her last name during the Q&A, something clicked. Later that evening, I did some discreet research and confirmed what I suspected. This passionate, brilliant young woman who wrote about holding corporations accountable for environmental damage was the daughter of the man who'd become my biggest client. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Here was this kid who worshipped her father, who talked constantly in her scholarship essays about how he'd inspired her to pursue environmental science, how he'd taught her that development should improve communities rather than harm them. She had no idea that her anonymous benefactor was sitting in trailer meetings with Daddy, watching him pressure consultants to cut corners that could poison children. But in that moment, facing Garrett's threat, I made a decision that would change everything. "I won't falsify the report," I said quietly. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "Then we have a problem." "No, Garrett, you have a problem. I'm writing my report exactly as the science dictates. The Brookfield site is unsuitable for an elementary school without extensive remediation that would cost millions of dollars and delay construction for at least 2 years. Then you're finished in this industry." I packed up my laptop and stood to leave, but at the trailer entrance, I turned back. "One more thing. That scholarship I've been funding at Central State, the one your daughter Madison receives, I think it's time she learned who her anonymous benefactor really is." For the first time in our conversation, Garrett looked genuinely confused. "What scholarship?" I smiled and stepped out into that beautiful September morning, breathing air that didn't smell like lies and compromise. What happened next was even more brutal than Garrett had promised. Within 2 weeks, my contracts with 3 other development companies were canceled. Suddenly, firms I'd worked with for years stopped returning my calls. When I applied for new projects, I was told positions had been filled, even though I could see the same job postings running weeks later. By November, I was working part-time at a coffee shop just to pay my bills, spending my evenings researching bankruptcy lawyers and wondering if I'd made the stupidest decision of my life. That's when I decided it was time to meet Madison. I found her studying in the university library on a Thursday afternoon, buried in textbooks about environmental policy. She was smaller than I'd expected from her conference presentation, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her father's pale blue eyes. She wore a faded t-shirt from an environmental advocacy group and had covered her laptop with stickers promoting renewable energy initiatives. "Madison Vance?" I approached her table carefully. She looked up, confused. "Yes? My name is Piper Delacroix. I'm an environmental consultant, and I have something important to tell you about your scholarship." Her face lit up with curiosity rather than suspicion. "Are you with the scholarship committee? I've been hoping to thank whoever's been supporting my education. It's completely changed my life." I sat down across from her, my heart racing. "Actually, I'm the person who's been funding your scholarship. I've been doing it anonymously for 3 years. Madison's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, gratitude, confusion. "You? But why? I mean, thank you, but I don't understand." "Because your essays about environmental justice were some of the most passionate, intelligent writing I'd ever read. Because you understand that our work isn't just about science, it's about protecting people who don't have the power to protect themselves." She was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "This is incredible. I can't believe I'm finally meeting you. Your support has meant everything to me and my family. My father talks about it all the time. How proud he is that someone recognized my potential." This was the moment I'd been planning for months. "Madison, I need to tell you something else. Something about your father." Her smile faltered slightly. "What about him?" I pulled out a folder containing copies of my original Brookfield report, the real one, with the actual contamination data. "Your father hired me to assess a development site where he's planning to build an elementary school. The soil contains dangerous levels of lead, cadmium, and arsenic. When I refused to falsify my report to hide the contamination, he had me blacklisted from the industry. Madison's face went pale as she looked through the documents. This can't be right. My father would never ask someone to cover up environmental hazards. He's the one who taught me that development should improve communities. I thought you should know, I said gently. Not because I want to hurt your relationship with him, but because you deserve to understand what's being done in the name of progress. She stared at the soil analysis data, her hands trembling slightly. These numbers. If this is accurate, children could develop learning disabilities, behavioral problems. That's why I couldn't lie about it. That's why I'm telling you now. Madison closed the folder and looked at me with those eyes that were so much like her father's, but filled with a pain he'd never shown. What do you want me to do with this information? Nothing, I said, standing to leave. This isn't about what I want. It's about what you can live with, knowing. That conversation happened on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, everything began to unravel for Garrett Vance in ways I never could have predicted. Madison didn't confront her father immediately. Instead, she did something much more devastating. She started asking questions. Over dinner that weekend, she casually mentioned a news article about lead contamination at a school in Ohio. Dad, something like that could never happen with one of your projects, right? You always make sure environmental testing is thorough? Garrett, completely unaware of our conversation, launched into his usual speech about responsible development and rigorous safety standards. Madison listened and nodded, taking mental notes of every claim he made. Then she started researching his other projects. Madison was a senior environmental science student with access to university databases, public records, and professors who specialized in environmental law. She began pulling permits, inspection reports, and compliance documents for every development Garrett had completed in the past 5 years. What she found destroyed her faith in everything she thought she knew about her family. 3 projects with environmental corners cut, 2 instances of permits obtained through questionable means. 1 case where a wetland had been filled without proper authorization, resulting in flooding that damaged a dozen homes downstream. But Madison didn't explode. She didn't create drama or demand explanations. Instead, she grew quiet, distant, intellectually superior in a way that slowly drove Garrett insane. During family dinners, she started making observations about corporate environmental responsibility. She'd mention news stories about companies that prioritized profits over public health, speaking with the kind of quiet moral certainty that made everyone at the table squirm. It's interesting how some developers will compromise anything to meet a deadline, she'd say while passing the salad. Like they think making money justifies poisoning communities. Garrett initially dismissed these comments as typical college idealism. You'll understand when you're working in the real world, he'd tell her. Everything's more complicated than it seems in textbooks. But Madison would just smile, that patient smile of someone who knows exactly how complicated things really are. She changed her major to environmental law the following semester. When Garrett asked why, she said she'd decided corporate accountability was more important than pure science. Someone needs to hold companies responsible when they put profits before people, she explained over coffee during winter break. Garrett laughed nervously. That's a pretty hostile way to look at business, sweetheart. Most companies are trying to do the right thing. Madison just sipped her coffee and didn't respond. The distance between them grew wider every month. Madison stopped asking her father for career advice. She stopped sharing details about her studies. When he tried to discuss his projects, she'd change the subject or find reasons to leave the room. What made it truly brutal was that Garrett had no idea why his daughter was pulling away. From his perspective, their relationship was deteriorating for no apparent reason. He'd raised her to care about environmental issues, so why was she suddenly treating him like the enemy? He started overcompensating desperately. He began making increasingly dramatic gestures at work, funding unnecessary environmental studies, hiring additional consultants for projects that didn't require them, even turning down a profitable development contract because it involved wetland modification. But nothing worked. Madison remained polite but emotionally unreachable. The Brookfield project eventually collapsed when the city council discovered the contamination through their own independent testing. Garrett's company took massive financial losses, and his reputation in the development community suffered permanent damage. But the professional consequences were nothing compared to the personal devastation of losing his daughter's respect. Years passed. Madison graduated law school and took a position with the State Environmental Protection Agency, prosecuting companies that violated environmental regulations. She became excellent at her job, ruthlessly thorough, impossible to intimidate, completely incorruptible. Garrett retired early, spending his final decade in the industry trying desperately to rebuild his reputation through environmental advocacy work. He funded scholarship programs, supported conservation initiatives, and spoke at conferences about sustainable development practices. None of it mattered to Madison. She attended family events but remained coolly professional, discussing weather and current events with the distant politeness usually reserved for acquaintances. What Garrett never understood was that I hadn't destroyed his career. I'd done something much more precise and permanent. I'd destroyed the unconditional love and admiration from the one person whose opinion mattered most to him. The beautiful irony was that Madison became exactly the kind of environmental advocate she'd always dreamed of being. The scholarship money I'd invested in her education had created a powerful force for justice in the world, just not in the way her father had intended. Every case she prosecuted, every company she held accountable, every corrupt practice she exposed was funded by the same moral clarity that had made me choose honesty over financial security in that trailer 3 years earlier. But this story isn't over yet, because what happened at the trial 6 months ago changed everything again in ways that still give me chills when I think about it. 6 months ago, I got a call that I never expected to receive. It was from an attorney with the State Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Delacroix, we're prosecuting a case involving systematic environmental fraud across multiple development projects. Your name has come up as someone who may have relevant testimony. My stomach lurched. What kind of case? Environmental data, falsification, permit fraud, and conspiracy to endanger public health. The lead prosecutor specifically requested that we contact you. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courthouse waiting room, wearing the only professional suit I still owned, watching lawyers shuffle papers and wondering how my life had led me back to this moment. The case was bigger than I'd imagined. Garrett's company wasn't the only one involved. The prosecution had uncovered an entire network of developers, consultants, and regulatory officials who'd been collaborating to circumvent environmental protections for over a decade. Millions of dollars in profits, dozens of compromised sites, thousands of families exposed to contamination. But what I didn't know until I walked into that courtroom was who the lead prosecutor would be. Madison Vance stood at the prosecution table in a navy suit, her dark hair pulled back in the same style she'd worn in the university library all those years ago. She was 31 now, the same age I'd been when her father tried to destroy my career. But there was something steel-hard in her posture that hadn't been there before. A quiet authority that commanded respect from everyone in the room. She glanced up as I entered, and for just a moment, our eyes met. Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker across her face, recognition, maybe even gratitude. I took a seat in the gallery and watched her work. Madison was devastating, methodical. She presented evidence with surgical precision, dismantling the defense's arguments piece by piece. She'd spent 3 years building this case, tracking financial records, interviewing witnesses, analyzing environmental data that had been falsified across multiple sites. What became clear as the trial progressed was that Garrett's pressure on me hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of environmental fraud that had been going on for years, involving dozens of consultants who'd been willing to adjust their findings for the right price. But I'd been the only one who'd refused. And because I'd refused, because I'd been blacklisted, because I'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose, I'd kept every document, every email, every piece of evidence from my work with Garrett's company, stored carefully in files that I'd never expected to use. When Madison called her witnesses, she started with the consultants who'd cooperated with the fraud. One by one, they testified about the pressure they'd received, the threats, the promises of future work if they played along. Their testimony painted a picture of an industry where environmental protection had become just another line item to be negotiated. Then came the corporate executives, trying to minimize their involvement, claiming they'd trusted their consultants and had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. Finally, Garrett himself took the stand. He looked older than his 63 years, wearing an expensive gray suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost. His confidence from that trailer meeting was completely gone, replaced by the defensive posture of someone who knew he was trapped. Madison questioned him with professional detachment, walking him through project after project where environmental corners had been cut. Her voice never wavered, never revealed any personal connection to the defendant. Mr. Vance, regarding the Brookfield Elementary School site, you hired environmental consultant Piper Delacroix to assess soil contamination, correct? Yes. And when Ms. Delacroix's initial report showed lead concentrations 3 times above safety standards, what did you tell her? Garrett's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. I asked her to double-check her findings. Double-check or change them? I wanted to make sure they were accurate. Madison pulled out a folder. Mr. Vance, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 47. This is an email from your assistant to 3 other environmental consulting firms, sent 2 days after Ms. Delacroix submitted her report. Would you read the subject line aloud? Garrett's face went pale. Urgent. Need environmental consultant willing to work with challenging timelines. And in the body of that email, what instructions did your assistant give regarding the Brookfield site assessment? I don't recall the specific wording. Allow me to refresh your memory. Quote, previous consultant was inflexible regarding acceptable contamination parameters. Need someone who understands real-world development constraints. End quote. What did you mean by inflexible regarding acceptable contamination parameters? The courtroom was completely silent. Even Garrett's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. I meant that Ms. Delacroix wasn't considering the broader context of the project. The broader context being your financial investment? Objection. Sustained. But the damage was done. Madison had methodically demonstrated that Garrett hadn't just asked me to adjust numbers, he'd immediately sought other consultants who would be more flexible about poisoning children. After 3 days of testimony, the judge called for a brief recess before closing arguments. That's when something happened that I still can't quite believe. Madison approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Ms. Delacroix, could I speak with you privately for a moment? We found an empty conference room, and for the first time in 6 years, we were alone together. I never properly thanked you, she said quietly. For what? For refusing to lie, for telling me the truth about what my father really was, for losing everything rather than compromise your principles. I looked at this brilliant woman who'd become everything I'd hoped she would when I first read her scholarship essays. You didn't need me to become who you are, Madison. That was always inside you. She was quiet for a moment. Do you know what the hardest part was? Not losing respect for him. It was realizing that everything I'd admired about him was a lie I'd told myself. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt your relationship with your father. You didn't hurt it, she said firmly. You revealed what it really was. There's a difference. That afternoon, Madison delivered her closing argument with the kind of moral authority that comes from someone who's faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger. Environmental fraud isn't a victimless crime, she told the jury. When developers falsify contamination data, when consultants adjust numbers to meet financial deadlines, when regulatory officials look the other way, they're stealing something precious from communities, the right to make informed decisions about their children's health and safety. She gestured toward the evidence table, stacked high with falsified reports and fraudulent permits. The defendants want you to believe this was just business, just the normal give and take of development projects. But what they're really asking you to accept is that profits matter more than playgrounds, that meeting construction deadlines is more important than preventing learning disabilities in 6-year-olds. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. But the moment I'll never forget happened just before the judge dismissed the court. Your Honor, Madison said, standing at the prosecution table. Before we conclude, the state would like to recognize someone whose integrity made this prosecution possible. The judge looked curious. Proceed, counselor. 6 years ago, environmental consultant Piper Delacroix was asked to falsify contamination data that would have exposed hundreds of children to lead poisoning. She refused, even though she knew it would destroy her career. Her decision to prioritize public health over personal financial security preserved the evidence that made this case possible. Madison turned to look directly at me. "Ms. Delacroix, would you please stand?" I felt like I was in a dream as I rose from my seat in the gallery. Every person in that courtroom was looking at me. Jurors, lawyers, reporters, family members of the defendants. "Your Honor, I would like the record to reflect that justice was served today, not just through the legal system, but through the courage of someone who chose to do the right thing when it cost her everything." The judge nodded solemnly. "The record will so reflect. Ms. Delacroix, this court recognizes your commitment to professional integrity under extremely difficult circumstances." As I sat back down, I noticed Garrett staring at me from the defendant's table. For the first time since that trailer meeting 6 years ago, he looked like he truly understood what he'd lost when he tried to force me to compromise my principles. After the sentencing hearing 2 months later, I ran into Madison one more time outside the courthouse. Garrett had received 3 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines that would wipe out most of his remaining assets. "How are you doing?" I asked her. "Better than I expected," she said. "It's strange, but prosecuting this case felt like honoring everything I thought my father had taught me about environmental responsibility, even though he was the one I was prosecuting." I understood what she meant. In a twisted way, Garrett had raised her to become exactly the kind of person who would hold him accountable for his crimes. "What's next for you?" she asked. I smiled, thinking about the consulting contracts that had started coming in after the trial publicity. Companies wanting to hire the environmental consultant who'd been willing to get blacklisted rather than falsify safety data. "I think I'm going to be okay." "Good," Madison said. "The world needs more people who choose integrity over convenience." As I watched her walk away, I thought about the scholarship money I'd invested in her education all those years ago. It had been the best investment I'd ever made, not just financially, but morally. That money had helped create a prosecutor who'd just sent dozens of environmental criminals to prison and protected thousands of families from contamination. But the real revenge wasn't sending Garrett to prison. It wasn't even destroying his relationship with his daughter. The real revenge was that Madison had become living proof that environmental protection and corporate accountability were more important than family loyalty. Every case she prosecuted, every company she held responsible, every corrupt practice she exposed was a monument to the principles her father had tried to make me abandon. She'd become the person he'd pretended to be, while he'd revealed himself to be everything she'd been trained to prosecute. And somewhere in a federal minimum security facility, Garrett Vance was spending his days thinking about the choices that had cost him everything that mattered: his freedom, his reputation, his company, and most devastatingly, the love and respect of the daughter who'd once believed he was a hero. The beautiful irony was that in trying to destroy my career for refusing to poison children, he'd created the exact conditions that would lead to his own destruction by the child he loved most. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about what you do to someone. Sometimes it's about who you help them become. If you've made it this far in my story, I need you to do something for me. I need you to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell. Not because I need the algorithm boost, but because stories like this need to be shared. Because there are people out there right now facing the same choice I faced in that trailer 6 years ago, the choice between doing what's right and doing what's profitable. They need to know that sometimes, when you refuse to compromise your principles, the universe finds a way to turn your integrity into the exact weapon needed to defeat the people who tried to destroy you for having it. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. "I've been trying to cancel you for years," Brent laughed, his teeth gleaming under the harsh office lights. The performance review form between us showed a sea of red marks and disappointingly low scores that contradicted everything my team had accomplished this quarter. "You know what's fascinating?" he continued, leaning back in his chair. "No matter how many roadblocks I put in your way, you keep crawling back. It's almost admirable." The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. My department had just broken every sales record in company history. Our client retention was at an all-time high. Yet here I sat, being told I was underperforming. The board has concerns about your leadership abilities, Brent said, sliding the evaluation toward me. You struggle with collaboration. You don't embody our values. Each word dripped with manufactured concern, while his eyes sparkled with victory. I felt something crack inside me, not my spirit breaking, but the dam holding back 5 years of calculated patience. Does the board know about the Anderlin account? I asked quietly. Brent's smile flickered. What about it? Just curious if you told them who actually saved it after you abandoned the client during their crisis, or if they know whose strategy doubled their spending. That was a team effort, he snapped, color rising in his cheeks. Interesting. That's not what Tom Anderlin says. I reached for my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. He was quite specific in this letter to the CEO about whose ideas revolutionized their marketing approach. Would you like to see it? His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. I noticed a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the chilly room. What is this? He whispered, the paper rattling in his grip. Just one piece of a much larger puzzle I've been assembling, I said, watching as he scanned the contents. For 5 years, you've been taking credit for my work, isolating me from the team and undermining my contributions. Did you really think I wouldn't keep receipts? Brent's face drained of color as he flipped through the pages. These are confidential client communications. How did you... Every client whose business I saved after you nearly tanked it. Every idea you stole and presented as your own. Every meeting you deliberately excluded me from. I leaned forward. And that's just the beginning. The paper crumpled in his grip. This is career suicide. You think anyone will believe you over me? I smiled for the first time since entering the room. I don't need them to believe me, Brent. The evidence speaks for itself. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. This meeting is over. I'll be speaking with legal about your unauthorized collection of company documents. Before you do that, I said, still seated, you might want to check your email. I believe the board just called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. We've both been summoned. His hand froze on the doorknob. What have you done? Nothing compared to what you've done to me for 5 years. The difference is, I can prove everything. Wait, don't scroll away yet. If you've ever dealt with a toxic boss or watched someone take credit for your hard work, you know exactly how this feels. Hit that like button if you're rooting for justice. Subscribe to hear how this revenge unfolds, and drop a comment about the worst boss you've ever had. Trust me, what happens next will make your jaw drop. My name is Tavia Wright, and until yesterday, I was the most invisible high performer at Radius Marketing. I'm 34, single, and until Brent Lancaster became my boss 5 years ago, I was on the fast track to becoming the youngest director in company history. People often describe me as quietly determined. I notice details others miss. I remember conversations verbatim, months after they happen. I can spot patterns in chaos. These traits made me exceptional at my job and ultimately gave me the tools to save my career from a man determined to destroy it. The war began during my 3rd year with the company. I developed a workflow system that would revolutionize how we handled multi-channel campaigns. When I presented it during our quarterly strategy session, the senior leadership team was visibly impressed. Questions flew. The CEO called it potentially transformative. Brent, newly promoted to department head, sat silently at the end of the table. I didn't recognize the danger in his tight smile. 3 days later, Brent called an all-hands meeting. I've been thinking about Tavia's presentation, he announced to the room. While the concept has potential, it needs significant refinement to be viable. He turned to the digital display and revealed what he called Brent's enhanced workflow system, my exact proposal with minor cosmetic changes, and his name splashed across every slide. Tavia had the seed of something interesting, he said, not meeting my eyes, but it needed my improvements to actually work within our infrastructure. I opened my mouth to object, but the words died in my throat as I watched my colleagues nodding along. By the end of his presentation, he'd effectively rewritten history. My breakthrough had become his brainchild that he'd generously developed from Tavia's rough concept. That afternoon, I confronted him in his office. You stole my work, I said, hands trembling with rage. Brent looked up from his computer with mild surprise. I improved your work, Tavia. There's a difference. Your version would have crashed against regulatory compliance issues. Mine won't. My version addressed compliance in Section 3. You just moved it to Section 2 and changed the header. He sighed as if dealing with a difficult child. This attitude is exactly why you're not ready for advancement. Great leaders share credit and celebrate team wins. They don't count pennies of recognition. This isn't about recognition. I'm concerned about your defensiveness, he interrupted. It suggests a lack of maturity that could impact the team. Let's talk when you've had time to reflect on your priorities. I left his office feeling hollow. It was a masterful manipulation. He'd not only stolen my work, but made my legitimate objections seem petty and unprofessional. That was just the beginning. Over the next month, my meeting invitations began disappearing from my calendar. Server glitch. It would say after I missed critical discussions. Important emails arrived in my inbox hours after everyone else received them. Client information reached me last, making me appear unprepared during calls. When clients specifically praised my strategies, Brent would interject, "She's part of my mentorship program, still developing her skills, but coming along." I began documenting everything immediately. Each glitch, every stolen idea, all the subtle ways he undermined me. At first, it was just for my sanity, proof I wasn't imagining things. I didn't know then it would become my salvation. 6 months into Brent's campaign, my formerly warm relationships with colleagues had cooled to polite distance. I'd catch fragments of conversations that stopped when I approached. Team lunches happened without invitations extending my way. "I've noticed you're isolating yourself from the team," Brent observed during a one-on-one. "Leadership is concerned about your ability to collaborate effectively." The cruelty was in its subtlety. Nothing was overt enough to file a complaint about. Each incident could be explained away as a misunderstanding or technology failure. But the pattern was unmistakable to me. I was being systematically erased. My breaking point came during the Williams project. After working nights and weekends on a comprehensive strategy, I arrived at the presentation to find Brent already there, my slides open on his laptop. "Good news," he told the client cheerfully. "I've refined the approach we discussed last week. Let me walk you through the improvements." I stood frozen as he presented my work, word for word, as his own. When the client loved a particular element I designed, Brent nodded appreciatively. "That section came together nicely," he agreed, never glancing my way. That night, I drafted my resignation letter. I sat staring at it until 3 a.m., the cursor blinking at the end of my digital surrender. Something stopped me from sending it, not hope, but a simmering anger that deserved direction. What if I stopped trying to win a rigged game and instead gathered evidence to expose it? The next morning, I deleted the resignation letter and created a new document instead. At the top, I typed, "The Lancaster Project, documenting systematic sabotage." My approach changed that day. I began playing a longer game. Instead of confronting Brent directly, I began operating in the shadows of our organization. I created a system to track every project, every idea, and every interaction. Each morning I arrived an hour before anyone else and sent myself emails detailing my daily plans and ideas. At night, I documented what actually happened versus what should have happened. I installed a discrete recording app on my phone for meetings. While technically allowed in our single-party consent state, I kept this quiet. Not for anything nefarious, just to ensure I had verbatim records of instructions given and conversations had. The most brilliant ideas often emerge from desperation. Mine came 3 months into my documentation project, when I realized simply proving Brent's sabotage wouldn't be enough. I needed to prove my value in a way no one could deny or diminish. I developed what I called my twin strategy approach. For every client project, I created 2 versions. The official one that would go through Brent, and a shadow version, implemented through careful alliances with overlooked team members. I began identifying others who had been sidelined by Brent's favorites, talented people whose ideas were consistently ignored. Paige from analytics had been relegated to running basic reports despite having advanced modeling skills. Devin from creative was consistently assigned mundane production tasks, while his innovative concepts were handed to others to execute. Liam from client services had been labeled too aggressive after questioning one of Brent's decisions. They became my first recruits. "I'm working on something off the books," I told them during a lunch I arranged at a cafe 3 blocks from the office, a proof of concept that might change things around here. Their skepticism was palpable until I showed them my documentation and explained my plan. "We continue doing our assigned work," I said, "but we also form a shadow team. We identify struggling accounts and quietly implement superior strategies, documenting everything so the results speak for themselves." "And then what?" Paige asked. "Brent takes credit again?" "Not this time," I promised. "This time, we build in attribution triggers that can't be removed or renamed." Devin leaned forward. "What kind of triggers?" "Digital watermarks in our designs that tie back to creator profiles. coded language and strategy documents that, when assembled, tell a story about authorship, client-facing materials with metadata trails. That sounds. Liam paused, searching for the right word. Elaborate? I suggested. I was going to say brilliant. He replied with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Our shadow team began with the Morriston account, a mid-tier client, on the verge of leaving due to disappointing results. While Brent assigned a junior strategist to create a maintenance plan, essentially hospice care for a dying account, our team developed a comprehensive revitalization strategy after hours. We implemented it piecemeal through our respective official roles. Paige noticed an opportunity in the data and suggested a small targeting adjustment. Devon happened to create alternative creative options during standard testing. Liam took initiative by offering the client enhanced reporting. None of these actions required Brent's approval individually, but together they formed our comprehensive strategy. Within 6 weeks, the Morriston campaign performance increased by 37%. When the quarterly review came, Brent was genuinely puzzled by the turnaround. "What changed with Morriston?" he asked during the department meeting. "Just some tactical optimizations," I replied neutrally. "Nothing major." His eyes narrowed slightly, but with positive results on the board, he could hardly complain. Instead, he did what he always did. He positioned himself at the center of the success. "This demonstrates how my guidance on continuous improvement principles is taking hold in the team," he told the senior leadership team later that week. I knew because Hayden from the strategy team texted me during the meeting. Our shadow team grew. Zoe from media buying joined after Brent dismissed her innovative channel strategy. Then came Riley from production, Emmett from market research, and Jesse from digital, all talented individuals who had experienced Brent's particular brand of managerial vampirism. We called ourselves the Invisibles, a name that began as self-deprecating humor but evolved into something like pride. We met weekly at different locations outside the office, each bringing accounts that needed rescue and ideas that deserved implementation. As our network expanded, so did our impact. The Invisibles' touch transformed struggling accounts into success stories. Clients who had been considering leaving became vocal advocates. Performance metrics in our influenced campaigns consistently outpaced others. The pattern became noticeable to everyone except Brent, who remained oblivious to the underground revolution happening within his department. His focus stayed fixed on taking credit for wins and assigning blame for losses. During my second annual review under his leadership, Brent gave me another below expectations rating, despite my accounts showing the highest growth percentages in the department. "Your individual performance metrics are acceptable," he acknowledged with faint praise. "But leadership requires more than numbers. It requires influence, which you seem to lack. Nobody in the department looks to you for guidance." I nodded solemnly, thinking of the 15 people who now attended our weekly Invisibles meetings. "You're not a team player," he continued. "You work in isolation." I thought of the collaborative workflow system our shadow team had developed, now managing projects across 3 departments. "And most concerning, you lack innovation," he concluded. "When was the last time you brought a truly new idea to the table?" I bit back a smile, thinking of the attribution triggers embedded in the quarterly report sitting on the CEO's desk at that very moment. "You're right," I said. "I'll work on those areas." Brent seemed almost disappointed by my acquiescence. He'd come to enjoy our confrontations, the opportunities they provided to remind me of my place. My new strategy of apparent submission confused him. Our shadow network's influence continued growing. We developed systems to share knowledge, distribute workload, and implement changes without drawing attention. The results were undeniable, though the source remained invisible to upper management. The breaking point came with the Anderlin account, our largest client and Brent's personal point of pride. Tom Anderlin, the marketing director, had been working exclusively with Brent for years. Their quarterly golf games and occasional vacation overlaps were common knowledge. When Tom called in a panic one Tuesday morning about a sudden competitor threat requiring an immediate strategy pivot, Brent was unreachable on the second day of a ski trip. The account team forwarded the emergency call to me as the next senior person available. "Tom, I understand the urgency," I said after listening to his situation. "I can have a response plan to you by tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" he balked. "The board meets at 9 a.m. to decide whether to shift budget to counter this threat. I need options today." I glanced at the clock. 10:37 a.m. "I'll have preliminary recommendations by 4 p.m., I promised, already mentally assembling my Invisibles team. Within 30 minutes, I had our core group huddled in a small conference room. By noon, we had analyzed the competitor threat and developed 3 potential response strategies. By 2 p.m., we'd refined these into a comprehensive counter-approach that leveraged insights from 5 different departments. At 3:58 p.m., I sent the strategy document to Tom. He called me immediately. "This is exactly what I needed. How did you pull this together so quickly?" "I work with an exceptional team," I replied truthfully. "Brent never mentioned you as a strategic lead," Tom said, confusion evident in his voice. "I'm relatively new to strategy development," I lied smoothly. "Still learning." The next morning, Tom called again. "The board approved your approach unanimously. They want a fast-track implementation. Can you lead the kickoff call today?" By the time Brent returned 2 days later, the Anderlin counter-strategy was already in motion. Tom had sent an effusive email to our CEO praising the remarkable strategic agility of the team. Brent came directly to my desk, his face tight with something between anger and fear. "What happened with Anderlin?" he demanded. I explained the situation clinically, emphasizing that I'd simply responded to an urgent client need in his absence. "You should have consulted me first," he snapped. "I know that account better than anyone. I tried calling you twice," I reminded him. "The client needed immediate action. Send me everything you've done. I'll review it and make necessary corrections before more damage is done." Later that afternoon, Brent called an emergency meeting with the Anderlin team. I watched as he attempted to reshape the narrative, positioning the strategy as something he had been developing before his trip and had asked Tavia to formalize in his absence. The problem came when Tom Anderlin unexpectedly joined the call for the last segment. "Brent, good to have you back," Tom said cheerfully. "I've already shared Tavia's strategy with our entire marketing team. They were impressed with the fresh approach, quite different from our usual playbook with you." Brent's smile faltered. "Well, as I was just explaining, the core concepts were part of ongoing work I've been directing." "Really?" Tom sounded genuinely surprised. "When we spoke last week, you recommended continuing our existing approach despite my concerns about the competitor movement." An uncomfortable silence fell across the video call. "Perhaps I misunderstood," Tom continued. "Regardless, we're moving forward with the strategy as Tavia presented it. In fact, our CEO was so impressed that he's requested she join our quarterly planning session next month." I watched Brent's face on the video screen as he realized he'd lost control of his premier client relationship. Something dark passed behind his eyes, a look I'd seen before, but never so nakedly displayed. That evening, as I prepared to leave, Brent appeared at my desk. "Impressive work with Anderlin," he said, his voice unnaturally pleasant. "We should discuss your career aspirations soon. Perhaps there's a growth opportunity we've been overlooking." The sudden shift was jarring, from years of undermining to apparent mentorship in the span of hours. But I'd documented too much, seen too much, to believe this represented genuine change. "That would be great," I replied with matched insincerity. As he walked away, I noticed him glance back with calculation in his eyes. I recognized that look. He wasn't offering advancement. He was plotting containment. I had become a threat that needed managing. What Brent didn't realize was how far beyond containment we had already gone. The Invisibles now numbered 23 people across every department. Our shadow strategies were driving results throughout the company, and the attribution triggers we'd embedded in our work were creating a data trail that led directly to the actual creators of value. The following week, the CEO's executive assistant contacted me directly. "Marian would like to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said. "She has some questions about recent performance patterns the data team has identified." When I arrived at the CEO's office the next day, I found not just Marian waiting, but the entire executive leadership team. On the conference table lay printed copies of performance analytics for every major account over the past 18 months. "Tavia," Marian began, "we've noticed some interesting patterns we hoped you might help us understand." I sat across from Marian, fighting to keep my expression neutral. Behind her composed demeanor, I sensed something significant was unfolding. The other executives, finance, operations, client services, and human resources, watched me with curious intensity. "Of course," I replied. "How can I help?" Marian gestured to the performance charts. Our analytics team identified something unusual. When we mapped account performance against strategy implementation, we found 2 distinct patterns. She turned a page to show color-coded graphs. Accounts following what we've been calling standard protocols show modest growth averaging 12% annually. But accounts using these alternative approaches She pointed to a separate set of bars soaring above the others, consistently outperformed by margins of 40 to 65%. The room fell silent as I processed what I was seeing. The Invisible's work, quantified and contrasted against Brent's approved strategies, laid bare for leadership to examine. What's most interesting, continued Marion, is that we can't determine where these superior strategies originated. They don't follow our standard approval workflows. The HR director leaned forward. When we tried tracing authorship through our systems, we found unusual patterns, embedded client codes, distinctive language structures, even metadata signatures that don't match our templated processes. My heart raced. Our attribution triggers had worked. They'd noticed the patterns without immediately identifying the source. Can you explain these anomalies, Tavia? Marion asked. This was the moment I'd both dreaded and anticipated for years. The complete truth would implicate not just me, but everyone in the Invisibles. A partial explanation might protect others, but would dilute the impact of everything we documented. I believe I can, I said carefully, but I need to understand what you're looking for. An explanation of methodology or accountability? Marion's eyebrow raised slightly. Both, I think. I took a deep breath. For nearly 2 years, I've been implementing alternative strategies outside the approved channels. The finance director frowned. You've been operating unauthorized client initiatives? No, I clarified. I've been doing my assigned work as directed, but where I identified opportunities for improvement, I also developed enhanced approaches that could be implemented within existing scopes of work. Without approval? The operations director looked troubled. I attempted to propose improvements through proper channels initially, I explained. I have documentation of 27 strategy recommendations submitted to departmental leadership over a 3-year period. None received approval for implementation. I pulled out my tablet and opened a folder containing every rejected proposal, along with subsequent communications showing how elements of those same ideas later appeared in Brent's presentations. Yet these same concepts, when implemented discreetly within approved activities, produced the performance improvements you've identified. Marion studied me with new intensity. Why work outside the system, Tavia? Why not escalate if your ideas were being suppressed? I tried, I admitted. Twice. I requested meetings with directors to discuss innovative approaches. Both times, the meetings were canceled after Brent spoke with them. I have the email chains. I showed them the correspondence, my meeting requests, the initial positive responses, followed by polite rejections after Brent's intervention. Eventually, I realized I needed indisputable evidence that my strategies worked, not claims or proposals, but actual results that spoke for themselves. The executives exchanged glances. Marion tapped her pen thoughtfully against the table. These attribution markers you embedded, was that part of building your case? I nodded. Each implementation included identifiers that couldn't be removed or repurposed without breaking functionality. They create a clear record of origin. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Finally, Marion closed her folder. Thank you for your candor, Tavia. We'll need time to discuss this internally. Please keep this conversation confidential for now. I left the meeting uncertain whether I'd just saved my career or ended it. While I had documentation supporting everything I'd said, I'd still admitted to working outside approved processes, something many organizations would consider grounds for termination. The next morning, Brent called me into his office, his manner unnervingly pleasant. Great news, he announced. I've recommended you for a special project in our Singapore office, 3 months helping them implement our workflow systems. It's a tremendous growth opportunity. The trap was transparent. Get me out of the building while he dismantled whatever evidence I'd presented to leadership. That's quite an opportunity, I replied, matching his false enthusiasm. When would this start? Immediately. The paperwork's being processed today. You'd fly out Monday. 3 days. Just enough time to pack. Not enough to organize my documentation or brief the Invisibles. I'm flattered by your recommendation, I said. Let me check some personal commitments and get back to you this afternoon. His smile tightened. The regional director needs confirmation today. It's a competitive placement. I understand. I'll have an answer by 3. As I turned to leave, he added, Leadership mentioned you had an interesting meeting yesterday. Anything I should know about? Just some questions about performance analytics, I said vaguely. Nothing substantial. His eyes narrowed slightly. Tavia, I hope you understand that any unauthorized work could potentially violate client contracts. That would have serious implications. The threat hung between us. step out of line, and face not just termination, but potential legal action. I simply nodded and left his office, my mind racing. Within minutes, I'd sent an emergency signal to the Invisibles, a calendar invitation for project archive review in the small conference room at lunch. When we gathered, I explained the situation. They're either investigating Brent's leadership or preparing to terminate me for working outside approved channels, I told the group. Either way, Brent's trying to ship me to Singapore immediately. That's exile, Paige said, horrified. Once you're overseas, he'll dismantle everything we've built. Not if we accelerate our timeline, I countered. We plan to present our complete findings next quarter, but we need to move now. For the next 3 hours, the Invisibles activated our contingency plan. Each member had maintained their own documentation trail, independent but interconnected with mine. By mid-afternoon, we had compiled everything into our shared secure folder, accessible only to members with multi-factor authentication. At exactly 2:55 p.m., I returned to Brent's office. I've considered the Singapore opportunity, I told him. Unfortunately, I can't accept it at this time. His pleasant facade cracked. This isn't really optional, Tavia. Leadership feels your skills would be valuable there. Interesting. That conflicts with what Marion told me this morning. I was bluffing. I hadn't spoken with Marion since our meeting. But Brent's reaction confirmed my suspicions. His face paled slightly. You spoke with the CEO? About what? About my future with the company. She suggested I stay exactly where I am for now. Before he could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at it, then back at me. We'll continue this discussion later, he said, reaching for the phone. I left, closing his door behind me, and immediately texted Emmett from Market Research. Phase 2 initiated. The following morning, I arrived to find my access badge deactivated. Security called Brent, who came to the lobby with poorly concealed satisfaction. There seems to be an IT issue with your credentials, he explained loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. While it's being resolved, HR has suggested you take a paid administrative leave. Is there a reason for this sudden leave? I asked, equally publicly. Just routine during certain types of internal reviews, he replied smoothly. Nothing to worry about if everything's in order. He escorted me to my desk to collect personal items, watching closely as I gathered my things. What he didn't know was that I needed nothing from my computer. Everything important had been secured externally long ago. I'll need your laptop as well, he said. It needs to verify some usage logs. I handed it over without concern. Of course. Anything else? We'll be in touch soon, he said, his confidence restored now that he believed he'd contained me. As I left the building, I received a message from Riley. Execution completed. Countdown active. I spent the weekend in limbo, waiting for either termination papers or vindication. The Invisibles kept me updated through our secure channel. Brent had called emergency meetings with several team members, fishing for information about our network. He'd ordered IT to audit all my digital activities and assigned one of his loyalists to review all my client interactions. Monday morning, my phone rang. Marion's assistant, asking me to come to the office at 10 a.m. for a meeting. No details provided. When I arrived, security issued me a temporary badge with limited access. I was escorted not to Marion's office, but to the largest conference room. As the door opened, I saw not only the executive team, but also the full board of directors seated around the table. And there was Brent, his expression cycling between confusion and barely contained rage. Tavia, thank you for joining us, Marion said. Please, have a seat. I took the only empty chair directly across from Brent. Marion addressed the room. Following our preliminary review last week, we expanded our investigation into the performance anomalies identified by analytics. What we found necessitated this emergency session. She nodded to her assistant, who distributed folders to everyone present. For the past 5 years, our company has experienced 2 parallel realities, Marion continued. The official one, documented through our standard processes, and an unofficial one that has actually driven most of our growth. She opened her folder. This report quantifies the impact of both approaches across every metric that matters: client retention, revenue growth, team satisfaction, and innovation implementation. The differences are stark. The board members flipped through their copies, expressions growing more serious with each page. Most disturbing, Marion continued, is evidence of systematic suppression of talent and ideas, particularly from women and minorities within the organization. We found documented cases of idea theft, deliberate exclusion from critical meetings, manipulated performance reviews, and strategic isolation of high performers. Brent shifted uncomfortably. If I may. Not yet, Marion cut him off. We've also discovered something extraordinary. A network of employees who found ways to create value despite these obstacles. They call themselves the Invisibles, and they've been responsible for saving our largest accounts and driving our most significant innovations for years, all while receiving poor performance ratings and being passed over for advancement. She turned to me. Tavia, as the board requested, would you walk us through how this parallel system operated? For the next 30 minutes, I outlined how the Invisibles had formed, documented our work, and created attribution systems that couldn't be manipulated. I explained how we'd developed a method to implement superior strategies within approved workflows, allowing for direct performance comparison. Throughout my presentation, Brent's expression darkened. When I finished, he leaned forward. This is a manufactured narrative, he insisted. Tavia has manipulated data and worked outside approved channels, violating company policy and potentially client contracts. She's coordinated insubordination across departments. These are terminable offenses, possibly even legal matters. The room fell silent. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Brent was skilled at reshaping narratives, and his confidence was unwavering. Then Devin from Creative opened the door, followed by Paige, Liam, Zoe, and 15 other members of the Invisibles. You requested the full team for this portion, Marion? Devin asked. Marion nodded. Yes, please come in. As the Invisibles filed in, taking positions around the perimeter of the room, I watched Brent's confidence crumble. These weren't just junior employees he could dismiss. These were respected professionals from every level and department. Each of you has reviewed the report and provided input, Marion said to the group. Is there anything missing or misrepresented in the findings? One by one, the Invisibles offered additional context, specific examples, and personal testimonies. With each new voice, Brent seemed to physically shrink. When they finished, Marion turned to him. Brent, you've heard the evidence. What do you have to say? He straightened his tie, attempting to regain composure. This is clearly a coordinated attempt to undermine my leadership by people who resisted necessary change. I made difficult decisions to maintain standards and ensure accountability. If some felt that process was unfair, there were proper channels to address those concerns. Like the channels Tavia used to submit 27 improvement proposals that you rejected, then later implemented under your own name? Asked the head of operations. Or the proper channels used by 12 employees who requested transfers from your department, all of whom reported retaliatory behavior afterward, added the HR director. Brent's composure slipped further. This is absurd. I've consistently delivered results. Have you? Marion interrupted, pointing to the performance charts. Because our analysis shows your approved strategies underperformed against every benchmark, while the work you actively suppressed drove all our significant growth. She closed her folder with finality. The board has reviewed these findings and reached a unanimous decision. Effective immediately, we're restructuring the entire organization around demonstrated performance rather than hierarchical position. She turned to me. Tavia, we'd like you to lead the transformation team, working directly with the board to implement the collaborative systems your group has already proven effective. The shock must have shown on my face. This went beyond vindication. They were putting me in position to reshape the entire company. Brent stood abruptly. This is outrageous. I've given everything to this company for 11 years. And taken much that wasn't yours, replied Marion calmly. Human Resources will discuss transition options with you after this meeting. As Brent stormed out, the room fell momentarily silent before erupting in congratulations and relief. Board members approached to introduce themselves, executives offered support, and the Invisibles exchanged looks of vindication. Later, as the room cleared, Marion pulled me aside. You could have left, she said. Many would have. After experiencing what you did. I considered it, I admitted. Why stay and fight this battle? I thought about it for a moment. Because places only change when people care enough to fix them instead of flee them. And because I refused to let someone else's insecurity determine my worth. She nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm glad you stayed. We have a lot of work ahead, and a lot of invisible talent to make visible again. As I left the building that evening, I checked my phone to find dozens of messages from Invisibles members. Not just celebration, but ideas for the transformation ahead, already thinking beyond vindication to actual change. I smiled as I texted back, the real work starts tomorrow. No more invisibility. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. So many of us have faced workplace injustice or watched talented people get pushed aside, while others take credit for their work. Share your experience in the comments. How did you handle a similar situation? Did you fight back or walk away? Hit subscribe if you want more stories about standing up to workplace bullies and reclaiming your power. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting ahead by proving your worth so loudly it can't be ignored.